All right, hi guys. Welcome to the rigging video. The way we're going to set this up is we are going to rig this character right here. I'm going to break it up into different sections. We're going to start with the legs, then we'll do the arms, then we'll do the spine and the head. From there, we'll do some squash and stretch setup, and then finally we will skin the character. Okay, so for this video, what we're going to focus on is rigging the legs. We're going to be doing IKFK switching so that you have a lot of flexibility with the character. And then we'll just go up the body and finish it up over a series of videos here. Okay, so this is what we have here. This cartoony style character here. And I'm just going to go ahead and start with the legs. So the first thing that we want to do is draw the leg chain. Now what you'll notice is that the way that I modeled this character was I tried as much as possible to model the character so I can have a leg chain that goes straight down from the hip all the way through to the foot. Sometimes people model the characters with an angle to the legs, and that's fine. I mean, it can still work, but to make life easier, I like to make sure that the legs are perfectly straight up and down. The other thing that you'll notice is the feet are pointing forward. You know, different characters walk different ways. Some characters, their toes are out. Some characters, their toes are in. And sometimes people will model them that way. Now, I don't like to model them that way. I like to model everything nice and straight. That way, when I put the leg joints in there, everything is nice and straight and plainer, because it helps. It helps with the rigging, makes things a little bit easier. And determining how a character walks and stuff, we leave that to the animators. It's not really up to the modeler to model any of that stuff in there. Same thing with the arms. I try to keep them as planar as possible. Planar is what you want. You don't want this wrist area to sort of come up at an angle, sort of breaking the plane of that arm. You want to keep it as planar as you can. It's just going to make for better, easier rigging. I put a little bit of bend in the elbow, and I put a little bit of bend in the knees, just to make it easy to rig. And so on and so forth. So we don't model any, major posture issues or anything like that into a character. We'll let the character animator put those in using the rig when it's all done. Okay, so this is the starting point we have here. So let's go ahead and begin drawing the leg joint chain. So first thing I'm going to do is switch to my rigging menu set. I'm going to go into skeleton. I'm going to go into create joints. I'm just going to reset that tool just so that I know I'm working at default settings. Okay. The way that Maya works by default is the x-axis of a joint. So let's just go in the side view here. I'll show you what I mean. So if I drew 1, 2, 3, so let's pretend that's our hip, our knee, and our ankle. You will see that if I activate my move tool here and if I double click it, I just want to make sure that my axis orientation is set to object. By default, it is set to world, and you'll see that when it's set to world, it doesn't really tell us anything. Okay, I want it to be set to object. That way I can, just by selecting a joint, I can see the orientation of it. And that's just a visual thing for me that makes my life easier. So by default, we have the x-axis pointing from parent to the child. Okay, and with the y-axis sort of forward or up, and the z-axis going out of the side. That is the default orientation. We are going to we're going to draw them and then just reorient them ourselves. So it doesn't really matter what it's doing by default. We're going to change that as we go. And you'll notice that if I go down to the next one, see, this one is actually flipped backwards. You remember how this one, the y is going that way, and this way the y-axis is going that way. So we need to fix this anyway. So don't worry about what the default is, because we're going to have to reorient the joints anyway. So, all right, I'm going to delete this joint chain here. And let's go in our side view. I want to make sure that in the viewport, I want to turn on X-ray joints. That way, no matter, if the joints are inside of the geometry, I'll still be able to see them. Okay, so again, I can go in the skeleton, create joints, or I can open up my rigging menu set and my rigging shelf, and we have our joints right there. Okay, so I'm just going to sort of approximate where that hip is. And the nice thing about joints is you can click. Oh, my mouse is acting crazy. You can click and drag until you're sure where you want that joint to be, and then release the mouse, click again at the knee, and then you can drag. And I like my knee joint to be, if this is like 50%, I like it to be sort of forward of that 50% mark. Okay, then I'm going to go down to the ankle, right about somewhere right in there where those bones on the side of your foot would be, more or less about there. And a lot of this is going to be trial and error. You might have to skin the character, see how that works. If it doesn't work, unskin it and reposition those joints. Then the next joint is going to be at the ball of the foot. So somewhere, wherever that foot is going to be bending from, would be right about there. And then I like to hold down shift and click to the left and put in the toe joint. Now the reason that I hold down shift is so that this is a straight line here. Oops. Okay, and then when I have the toe, I can hit enter. So this is what we have here. Okay, so because of the way that joints are set up, when you draw in the side view, it's going to put it right on that YZ plane line. So we have to shift it over, and again I have to turn on X-ray joints in here. Now I can see those joints, and it might actually be a good idea to do it in the front view. Turn on X-ray joints again, and you'll see that the way that I have it set up, I can put a perfectly planar straight joint chain down this leg, and I think that'll work. I think that'll work in the positioning that I have here. Let's go in the perspective and look at it from there. Yeah, I think that's gonna work. Okay, so let's just make sure. Yep, I think that's gonna work pretty well. So let's name the joints. So the top one, if I hold down shift and click on the plus next to joint 1, it's gonna open up the entire joint chain for me. So this is hip, go down to this is knee, go down to ankle, go down to ball, and the last one is toe. Okay, so hip, knee, ankle, ball, toe. And then I'm going to select the hip joint. I'm going to go to modify. I'm going to go to prefix hierarchy names. I'm going to put an L underscore as a prefix, so that tells me that this is the left side. Okay, there's no point writing out the word left. It's just going to make your your name longer for no reason. When you see the L, you know that it's the left side. Okay, next thing that we're going to want to do is reorient the joint chain. So I'm going to go to skeleton, go in the orient joint settings here, and let me see what I want here is, let me just make sure that I have the right one. We want XYX with a positive here, with a plus sign here, making sure that orient children of selected joints is also selected. And if I hit orient, you'll see now that my y-axis is coming out the side and my z-axis here is going out the front. That's the orientation that I want. So if I go down, if I press down on the keyboard, you'll see that they're all oriented that way except for this last one. Now the thing with the last one is, the reason that it's sort of oriented the way that it is because it doesn't have any children to point to. Okay, so what we're going to do is we want it we want it to match up with its parent, which in this case is the ball. As you can see, this is a hierarchy here, and the toe is a child of the ball. So we want to copy the orientation of the ball joint into that toe joint. And the way to do that is to select the toe joint, open up your attribute editor, and right down here under joint, we have a joint orient. So all we're going to do is set these values to 0. And what happens is you'll see now the orientation is exactly the same as the ball. Okay, so it just matches the orientation to the parent. Okay, so the joint orient values are like an offset from the parent. Okay, those values are how far rotated away from the orientation of the parent that joint is. And if you zero them out, it just aligns them to the parent's orientations. Okay, so that is the orientation that we're going to use. The y-axis is the one that's going to do the sort of forward and backward walking motion. Okay, now the next thing that we want to change is our rotate order. Okay, so rotate order is right here in the attribute editor. You select the joint and it's right there. So what is rotate order? So the way that Maya rotations work is that they're calculated an axis at a time. Okay, so when you have a rotate order of XYZ, what that means is Maya will calculate the z-axis first, then the y-axis, then the x-axis. So it's backwards that it's calculated. I don't know why they write it like this, but that's how they write it. It means that the last one is the one that's calculated first, then the second one, and then the first one. So what you'll notice, what I need to do is if I double click my move tool, or I can just hold down, sorry, not my move tool, my rotate tool, or I can just hold down E and left click and hold it down. Right now I'm set to object. If I go to gimbal or double click here and then select gimbal from here, what gimbal is showing us is the true rotations of each axis. Okay, so what happens if I go back in my attribute editor here? If I'm doing XYZ, like I said, Z becomes the dominant axis, which means it's the one that's calculated first, which is this blue one here. So if I rotate the blue one, you'll see that the other two will move along with it. If I then go to the y-axis, which is the second one, if I rotate that, you'll see that the z-axis, the blue one, does not move with it, but the x does. And then if I go to the x and rotate that, you'll see that nothing but the x rotates. Okay, that's because the z is the dominant axis. It's calculated first, then the y, and then the z. Okay, now in general, the twisting axis of a joint is the first one. And which is the twisting axis? Well, it's the x-axis, because that is the one that is pointing from parent to child. So if you're going to twist this leg, you would twist it around the x. So generally that's the one that is calculated last. And the reason that we want to make sure we set the correct rotate orders is because we want to avoid something called gimbal lock. So what is gimbal lock? So if we're in gimbal mode here with our rotate tool, you'll see that if I rotate on the y-axis, the second axis, because I'm in XYZ, if I just keep rotating on this axis, you'll see that my x and my z are starting to get really close to each other, and then at this point they're basically the same axis now. So those two have basically collapsed into one. Now I have lost an axis of rotation. That is what is called gimbal lock, because now if I should have an axis going across this way, I can't rotate that leg that way anymore. So that is gimbal lock. Okay, so it's kind of unavoidable. So the way that you try to get out of gimbal lock is by setting the correct rotate order. Okay, so how we determine the rotate order for the legs is by picking the right by deciding how the leg is going to move and rotate, and deciding which axis is going to be the dominant axis. Okay, we already know that the twisting axis is the x-axis, and usually that twisting axis is the first one. This is not the case all the time, but usually. Okay, so let's try different ones. XYZ. So we have to determine what is the most important movement that this leg is going to do. Right? You might think maybe it's this motion here. Okay, so that might make the y-axis the dominant axis, because characters, they walk. So this seems like it would be the most important one. Not necessarily the Z axis, although I mean, it depends on how you want to look at it, and this is you're gonna have to decide for yourself. There's not really a right or wrong answer here. It just depends on you and what you want to do with it. So if we said Z should be the dominant one, if we rotate it out in Z, we still have the ability to kick the leg forward like this. Okay, that's with an XYZ rotate order. If we say want our y-axis to be the dominant axis, we have two choices. We have ZXY, which won't work because, again, our x-axis is a twisting axis, so we want the x-axis last. So if we said XZY, what that'll give us is this will make the y-axis the dominant axis. You'll see now that the z-axis follows along with the y, and now we can kick out this way before we get into gimbal lock. So again, this is something that you will have to decide for yourself. Let me think. Let me see which one I prefer. So we have our forward and backward motion here, and then we have the ability to kick out the leg this way. Is that something useful? Sure. Let's go back to XYZ, and actually let me get my leg back to 0 rotation here, and then go to XYZ. So if this is the main motion that we're going to do, if I then need to rotate my leg up, it's gonna get a little bit weird. Or if I'm up here and then I want to rotate up, I can still kind of do that. Whereas XZY, if I make this the dominant axis, I can still kick it out this way, but now when I have that, it's going to do this. So I'm thinking XYZ, make Z the dominant axis. That'll still give me the ability to do that. But if I bring this out here and I want to kick the leg out sideways that way, I kind of don't have that because I'm in gimbal lock here. But I think this is gonna work though. I think I'm gonna leave it as XYZ and see how that works for me, because if I rotate the leg outward, I still have all the rotations that I want here. So I'm gonna leave it at XYZ for the hip. Let's go down to the knee. So the knee being a hinge joint, as compared to the hip joint, which is a ball and chain, not a ball and chain, good lord, a ball socket joint, ball and chain. The knee joint is a hinge joint. So what that means is it really only moves in the y-axis. Okay, so the y-axis is going to be my dominant axis here. So I'm going to switch this to XZY. Okay, so this is all it ever does. You never really see a knee bending out to the side this way, and you don't really ever twist on a knee either. At least not that I've seen. So generally, we only bend it in the y-axis. I'm just going to make the y the dominant one. And then back to now down to the ankle. At XYZ, what that's going to allow us, so if Z is the dominant axis, if you turn, I mean, you're going to be very limited in how much of this you're going to do at the ankle. The ankle does have the mobility of sort of like a ball joint, but you're not going to get a lot of this side-to-side motion just happening right here at the ankle. So if we say XYZ, so if I do kick my ankle, out or inward, I still have the ability to then rotate along this axis here. Whereas if I set it to XZY, Let me zero this guy out here. Okay, if I set it to X, Z, Y, so if I have my up and down motion, which is good, because that's where most of your mobility in the ankle is going to be happening. So if I have X, Z, Y, I still have the ability to rotate side to side. So, you could make a case for both X, Y, Z and X, Z, Y. But if you rotate out this way now, yeah, it's kind of a weird rotation. So you know what? I'm gonna go with XYZ on this one. Okay, so zero this out. So if we move side to side, we're still nicely aligned with the joint, so we can still go up and down. Okay, and if we start by going up, we can still rotate side to side. So I'm gonna go with XYZ. Again, it's up to you. Play with it. See what works for you. Then we go down to the ball joints. Make sure that I zeroed out my. Yep, I did. Okay. Then we go to the ball joint. So the ball joint again is more of a hinge joint. So it's really only gonna rotate this way. So again, I'm gonna use XZY. Because that is really all we're gonna. It doesn't even really twist. It's more just the up and down of the toes. So we're gonna go with XCY for the ball, and then the toe doesn't matter because it doesn't really do much. Okay, so we have XYZ at the hip, XZY at the knee, XYZ at the ankle, and XZY at the ball. Okay, so those are the rotate orders for the leg joints. Now we have oriented our joints correctly, and now we have given them rotate orders as well. Okay, so the next thing I'm going to do is mirror this over to the right side of the character. Okay, so let's see. What we're going to do is go to skeleton. We're going to go to mirror joints and open up the box. We're going to go with YZ as our mirror plane, because if you look at it this way, if you look at this little gizmo in the corner here, the Z-axis is the forward axis and the Y-axis is the upward axis. And those two axes make a plane that cuts the character perfectly in half. And that's the YZ axis. We're going to set the mirror function to orientation. It really doesn't matter because we're just going to reorient the joints anyway. We're going to search for L underscore and replace it with R underscore. So it's going to look for the L underscore in the name here, and it's going to replace that with an R underscore. Okay, so let's go ahead and mirror. And actually, you know what? I think it copied our orientations pretty well here. So, but I am kind of OCD, so I'm just going to go in and skeleton, and I'm just going to orient the joints. I know it's OCD, but you do what you got to do. So now we have the right leg, and if I open it up, right leg and left leg. Okay, now we need a parent joint for these here. So I'm going to make a pelvis joint. Again, I'm going to go in the side view, and I'm going to get my joint tool, and I need just a single joint that's sort of at the pelvis, where the pelvis is going to rotate from. So somewhere like there. Hit enter, and then call this joint. It's just a single joint. Call it pelvis. Pelvis. There we go. Okay. Back in perspective, I'm going to select both of the leg joints. Shift select the pelvis and hit P. So now the pelvis is the parent joint for those two leg joints. Okay. And there we have it. So the next step there is, so we've done the legs. So now we can go ahead and do the spine. So the first thing I like to do when drawing a spine is, figure out how many joints I want up the spine, first of all. Then I also want to figure out how I want to draw that spine. Do I want to have a curved sort of S-shaped spine like you find in a real human? Or do I want to have a straight spine? And in the cartoony style characters, I tend to go for the straight spine because I find that it bends a little bit nicer and gives me nicer shapes than the S-curve realistic spine. So we're going to go with a straight spine. So I'm going to select my joint tool again. Now the thing with the spine is that I want my joints to be perfectly evenly spaced all the way up the back. Now, if I was to sit there and try to draw them in a straight, perfect line, you can see that, you know, the spacing between the joints is not going to be great, and getting it perfectly straight, I mean, I guess I could hold down shift for that, but it's going to be hard to get them perfectly evenly spaced. So what I like to do is hold down X and snap them to the grid. And I need a total of 7 joints. So I'm going to hold down X and count 7. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, and 7, and then hit enter. So now I have a perfectly straight line of joints that is evenly spaced just like I want. But as you can see, if I try to move them to where the spine is, they're obviously way too long. So I'm going to open these all the way up. I'm going to select the last one and hold down shift and select the first one. Now that they're all selected, I'm just going to scale them down in X to right about where that neck starts, right in there somewhere. Okay. And when I'm happy with it, I'm going to go to modify and I'm going to freeze transformations. Oops. Let's select just the first joint and then do a modify, freeze transformations, and you'll see that for all these joints now the scales are back to 1, 1, 1. And for this, what we're going to do is, if I select my move tool, what we have here again, we have the y-axis going out this side. What I want to do is make the y-axis come out the right side, just like we have the y-axis going this way. I'm going to have the y-axis coming out the right side of the joint. So we need to reorient this. So again, go to skeleton, go to orient joint, and then we're going to set this so the primary axis will be the X, which is going up the spine. The secondary will be the Y, and we want the y-axis to point in the positive X direction. So same as we had before, if I hit apply, you'll see that my y-axis goes out this way. So now all of those are oriented that way. Okay, and just make sure that that last joint, if we go on the attribute editor, make sure that that last joint has a joint orient of 0, 0, 0. And there we go. So now that it matches its parent. Okay, and that's just something that you want to make sure that you do all the time for the end joints. Just set the joint orients to 0 so that it lines up with its parent. Okay, so rotate orders for these I'm going to leave at XYZ. So that's what's going to work. So let's rename these. So these are all spine 1 through 7. The default names are joint 1 through 7. So the easy way to do this without having to type spine in all of those is just select the top joint, go to search and replace names. No, I'm sorry, not search and replace names. Go to modify. You know what? It is search and replace names. So I'm going to look for the word joint and replace it with the word spine. And replace, and you'll see that they all get replaced. The last one, instead of spine 7, I'm going to call this spine end, just to let me know that that's the end of the spine. Okay, now there's different ways to figure out where the root joint of the character is going to be. Okay, you can have the root joint be that first spine joint, or you can have the root joint be the pelvis joint. Now, if you use the pelvis as the root joint, so if I select the spine, then the pelvis, and hit P, the joint chain starts at the pelvis. Now, the reason that I generally don't do this is because that gives you a very stiff pelvis. In he's not going to have independent hip motion if I do it this way. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to undo that. I'm going to select the pelvis first and the spine second, and hit P, so that spine 1 is the root joint of the skeleton, and you can see it is at the top there. What that's going to allow me to do is have independent control of this pelvis to, be able to control the hips separate from the rest of the body. I'm going to have a separate control just for the pelvis. That's going to give the character the ability to move their hips. If I had made the pelvis the root joint, what would have happened was we would have had a very stiff body, and by rotating the control for the pelvis, it would have rotated his entire upper body with it, and I don't want to do that. So I want to make sure that I give him some flexibility here, and I think this is going to work very well. Okay, so then what we want to do is draw the neck and head joint. So we're just going to continue from the spine. So here's how I'm going to do that. I'm going to select my joint here, and to make my life easier, my character's on a layer. At least I thought he was. I'm going to take the geometry here and just put it on this layer right here as selected object. So now I can turn him on and off this way. I'm going to take my joint tool. I'm going to hold down V, and I'm going to click, and it's going to snap that first joint to the spine end joint. I'm going to bring this back so I can see what I'm doing here. I'm going to put my next joint about halfway up his neck, and then I'm going to put the next joint, somewhere in here. This is the joint that's going to determine where the head is pivoting from. So usually that's somewhere behind the ear, so right about there. And again, you may have to do some trial and error to figure where a good position is for that. Okay, then I'm going to hold on shift and click up, just a joint straight up from there, and I'm going to enter. Okay, so let's open these up and rename. This is neck 1. So neck 1 is right on top of the spine end. Neck 1, I'm sorry, neck 1, neck A. The next one is neck B. Then we have head. Then we have skull. Okay, so that's just how I name my joints. Feel free to name them whatever you want. Now, I guess I could have just kept going here, but we got to create some more joints in here. So I'm going to get my joint tool again, and I'm going to click on my skull joint. And what that does is it tells Maya that any joints that we draw after this point are going to be children of that skull joint. Okay, so I'm going to drop a joint right about eye level here. It does not have to be exact. Then I need to figure out where my pivot point for my jaw is going to be. So usually that's somewhere around here, and again, you may have to do some trial and error. And then I'm going to click here to do the chin. Okay, so now we have all these joints connected here. Okay, so hit enter to exit there. Okay, so that's where our joint pivot is going to be. Now we need joints for the eyeballs, and the way that I do my eyeball joints, the eyeballs themselves, so this is our left eye, so I'm just going to isolate this. So if I hit 4, you'll notice, if you can see that, there is a locator sitting in the middle of this eyeball. And that's just how I do it. If you don't have that locator, so if I hide this locator and you want to know where the exact center of that eyeball is, you can select the eyeball, then go to display, transform display, selection handles, and you'll see that there's this little cross in there. That is the exact center of your eyeball. But make sure once you've used this, you turn it off, because it does have high selection priority, meaning that it'll get selected before. If you just drag a selection with multiple things, that will probably get selected before anything else. So I'm going to turn that off and just bring back my locator, because I find this to be a lot easier to do this just as my own preference, but by all means do it however you prefer. So I'm going to select my my joint tool again. I'm going to hold down V and snap a joint to that locator. Okay, I'm going to go in my side view, hold down shift and just click forward of that joint and hit enter. Okay, so we have a joint sitting in the exact center of that eyeball, so that when we rotate the eyeballs, they're rotating from the exact center as you would expect. I personally prefer to use joints to rig my eyeball. Some people will just put an aim constraint on the eyeball geometry and make it aim at something. I like to skin every part of the geometry, and the reason I do that is because I like to cache out my geometry. And if your eyeball is not being deformed, i.e. if it's not skinned, it doesn't cache out at all because it doesn't really consider that deformation. So I just like to skin everything, and that makes it easy to cache everything out and get so that I can get rid of the rig in the file. So with that done, for this main joint here, I'm just going to increase the radius a little bit just to give it, make it more visual for me. Okay, we're going to call this left L_I root. So that's the root joint of the eye, and then this is the left eye direction, so DIR. Okay, and I'm going to bring everything back here, and I'm going to mirror this joint across here. So it's at, let's see, it is at, so before I mirror it across, let's mess with the orientation. So to make life easier, I'm just going to orient this joint chain to world space, which is defined by this gizmo right here. So I'm going to go to skeleton, orient joint, and I'm going to set, let's see, is this going to work? Yeah. So just click on orient joint to world and hit apply. And now we have matching orientation to the world. It just makes it easy to get those aim constraints. And for these joints, it's not really all that important where how the orientations are. So just for ease of use, I like to just set it to world space orientation. And then I can go to skeleton and then mirror joints. And again, YZ, look for L underscore and replace it with R underscore and set it to orientation and mirror it across. And now we have the right side. Okay, so I'm going to save this file off. You want to make sure you save often because things do break, especially when you're rigging. So we're going to call this rig 01, and there we go. Okay, so that's what we have here. So before I forget, let's do the rotate order for the jaw. So select the jaw, go in the attribute editor, and what we have here is the z-axis. And hold on a sec, my mouse is acting crazy, so I am going to change mice. I think my mouse has seen its last days here. So okay, so got a new mouse. Hopefully everything will work fine. Okay, so again, where we were was with the jaw here. What I want to do is go in the attribute editor, and I got to figure out what my rotation order is going to be. In this case, the z-axis is the one that seems to work the best, right? That's the open and close. Now with the jaw, you also have the ability to do a little side to side here. So we have to decide what we're going to do. Let's see. So by default, it's at X, Y, Z. So if I say move my jaw to the side, then wanted to open it, I suppose I could, but now I'm not quite aligned with my joint here. So let's try making the Y the dominant axis. So let's go with X, Z, Y. So if I did rotate it to the side, you'll see that my Z axis is still oriented to the joint there. So you know, I could work with that. If I opened it, then swung it out, I would still be able to do that. So yeah, let's go with XZY on that. Okay, and we need to continue naming some of these joints. So this was the head, this was the skull. We'll call this the eye base, because the eye joints are going to plug into there. And then we'll call this jaw. And then at the end there is our chin. All right. So what we can do then is orient some of these joints here. And what we want to do is skeleton, orient joint. So I'm going to turn off orient joint to world. And we're gonna orient these a little bit different here. So we're gonna start with primary axis being Y, secondary being Z, and secondary axis world orient being Z plus with the positive. Okay, so we're gonna hit orient. So what that's done is it's kind of aligned everything to world space, because we had the Z coming out the side. Sorry, the X coming out of the side, the Z going forward, and the Y being our twisting axis. And I do this because this is what seems to work best for the head. And as we get into the rigging of the head and the spine, you'll see why I go with this particular rotate order. And now that I've done that, I think I need to change this rotate order to the Y being the twist axis is going to be first. And then we have, let's see, Z. So we're going to put Y first and Z last, I think. So Y, X, Z. So kick it out to the side and you still open it, kick it out to the side, and you're still aligned. So we'll go with the Y, X, Z on that rotation order. Okay. So when we're done with that, we're going to take the chin joint, and again we're going to set joint orients to 0, just to line it up with its parent. Okay, so if we select that joint, you'll see that it's aligned the same as that joint. Okay, so let's take both our eye joints and parent them to that eye base joint. So again, you select the two child joints first, then you select the parent and you hit P. So now everything is hooked together. Okay, so the spine and the head are done. So let's work on the arms. So again, like what I said before, we want to make sure that we stay planar with the arm chain. Now, this character is modeled with the 45-degree arms. Some characters are modeled with the arms straight out. It's just going to depend, you know, on how the modeler wants to do it. So the challenge with having 45-degree angle arms is try to keep everything planar. Because if they were straight out the side, you would be able to do that pretty easily by just drawing it at the top view. But because we're going at an angle, trying to keep everything planar it can be a bit of a challenge. But it's not too bad. As long as you understand what's going on, it's not too bad. So we're going to go into the, let's see, we're going to go on the top view. And we're just going to go and do a sort of general drawing of the joint chain. So shoulder, oh, you know what, let me turn on x-ray joints so I can see the joints. So somewhere in the shoulder, somewhere right around the elbow, and I'm going to go a little bit past where the wrist would be, and you'll see why in a minute. And I'm just going to draw those 3 joints. We're going to have more joints than this, but as a starting point, this is where we want to be. So what you'll notice is that they get drawn on the ground plane. So we need to pull this up, and you'll see that it's not even close to being correctly aligned. That's okay. What this did for us is it provided a planar joint chain. You see how flat those are? We want to make sure that we maintain that flatness throughout this process. So I'm just going to position my shoulder joint where I think it should be. And then I can rotate this joint chain in any direction. Oh, and I'm going to get out of gimbal mode here. I can rotate this joint chain in any direction on the shoulder, the topmost joint, and I maintain the planarity of that joint. It's still going to be planar no matter what I do. At the elbow joint, I cannot do that. As soon as I go up or down, I have now made this joint chain non-planar. I can rotate it on the y-axis, no problem, it stays planar. But if I go the z or the x-axis, I break it. Okay, so you need to be very careful. Actually, well, yeah, I do break it if I do it on the twist axis as well. So you need to be very careful with that. You can rotate the elbow on the y-axis, and it'll stay planar. Okay, all it's doing is opening and closing. It's going to stay planar that way. But as soon as I go on the z-axis, I break the planarity of it. So we need to be very careful that we don't do that. Okay, so what we have to do now is try to align it to the arms. I'm going to rotate down this way. I might twist it like this. And, you know, it's going to take a little messing with it to try to get everything to be straight. Okay, so I'm going to, now how do we move this elbow joint down to where the character elbow is? What we can do is scale. You see that if we scale on the x-axis, my joint chain stays planar. Okay, so I might have to go into the perspective view here and scale it down till we're right about where the elbow is. And if you need to, you can rotate this way and scale to right about there. And then we're here at the elbow, and again we can rotate on the y-axis this way, but not on the other two. So I'm going to bring this back this way, and I can also scale it on the z-axis, and I'm going to again scale it beyond where that wrist joint would be, which is somewhere there. I'm just going to scale that into the palm of the hand there. Okay, and again, I'll show you why in a minute. So that is our joint chain there. It's still planar, but we have now fitted it to the arm. Okay, and that's the other thing. You can translate the joint chain at the shoulder. You never want to translate a child joint, because again, you break the planarity of it, and you also break the orientations of it. So you can translate the topmost joint, but none of the child joints. Okay, so when we have it where we want it, we can go to modify freeze transformations, and I'm just going to go to modify. I'm going to hold on Control and Shift and click on freeze transformations, and you'll see that I get a freeze transformations shelf button. So I'm going to click on that because we did all, so I'm going to undo. We have all kinds of rotations in here. We messed with the scale. We want to get rid of that stuff. So if I freeze transformations, you'll see that my rotates and my scales clean up. My translates do not clean up. Reason being that these numbers here are an offset from the origin, from 0, 0, 0. Okay, these numbers represent how far away from the origin this joint is, and I cannot freeze those away. If I zero these out, you'll see that my joint snaps back to the origin. Okay, that is what happens at the top level joint. If I go down to my elbow joint, you'll see that the elbow joint only has an X value. Okay, and that's because by default Maya joints are oriented where the parent aims at the child along the x-axis. So what this value here represents is the distance from the parent that this child is. So that's the length of that bone pretty much. So if I was to zero this out, you'll see that it's going to take that joint and snap it back to its parent. So this value, so I'm going to undo that, this value is an offset of the child from the parent. So this is the distance. So it is 2.606 units away from its parent along the x-axis. Okay. If you have in the elbow anything, if you have translate Y or translate Z values, then something went wrong and your joint chain is no longer planar. If I move this, you'll see now I have a Y value in here, and that's because I just broke the planarity of my arm. So you want to make sure that you only have an X value, and the same thing for the that end joint there at the wrist. Okay, so there we go. The next thing that we need to do is put in our wrist joint. Okay, so we're going to have, there's actually two joints that we're going to put in. We're going to put in a wrist joint, and we're going to put in a forearm joint. Okay, so we're going to have a total of 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 joints. Okay, so let's put in the wrist joint. Now, the tricky part here is making sure that we maintain the planar nature of this joint chain. And we want to insert a joint without breaking the planarity. Luckily, there is a tool in Maya called Insert Joints. So we click at the elbow and drag down, and you'll see that it goes along the joint. It doesn't come off and break the planar nature of the joint. It maintains it. So I'm going to drag and stop right about where I think the wrist location should be. And I'm going to do it again, and this time I'm going to stop about halfway down the forearm. Okay, so we've inserted those two joints there like we needed. Okay, now why do we have a forearm joint here? Reason is that the twisting of the arm at the wrist does not happen at the wrist. It happens between the elbow and the wrist. Okay, if you twist your own arm, you will realize that it doesn't just twist at the wrist itself, but it happens all the way up that forearm. So allowing for a joint in here is going to give us the ability to make that happen in the character. Okay, that is a very important thing to do. You want to make sure that your wrist twisting happens at a forearm joint and not at the wrist. The up and down motion of the wrist can happen at the wrist. The side to side motion of the wrist can happen at the wrist, but the twisting needs to be more gradual. It needs to sort of fall off from the from the elbow down. Okay, so now that we have all these joints, I'm going to open these up, and we're going to call this first one shoulder. The next one is elbow. Then we have forearm and wrist. And then what do I call the last one? Palm. Now, why do I have a palm joint? Well, the reason that I have the palm joint is that when we start to draw the IK handles for this arm, if you only have an IK handle from the shoulder to the wrist, what happens is that when the character moves, say if he plants his hand on a table, for example, and then his body moves around while trying to plant the arm, the handle tend to sort of roll and move. But if I have a second IK handle running from that wrist to the palm joint, then it locks that hand down perfectly. So that is just something that I like to do. I'm sure there's other ways to do it, but I have found that that works best for me. Okay, so shoulder, elbow, forearm, wrist, palm. And I'm going to select the shoulder, go to modify, prefix hierarchy names, and put an L underscore on there. Okay. Then the next thing we need is a clavicle joint. So the clavicle joint usually is somewhere right in this area at the front of the chest. So what that joint does, it allows the character to lift their arms above their head. Okay, if you take your arm and raise it above your head, you'll see that at some point it stops just being a shoulder motion, and you start to put in the clavicle, so that raises your shoulder. That the clavicle is also the joint that allows you to shrug your shoulders. So we need to make sure we put that in. So I'm going to go in the front view here, And usually somewhere around there. I'm just going to hit enter. And I'm going to go in this perspective view. You got to make sure that the clavicle is sort of forward of where the shoulder joint is. And you're going to have to maybe do a little bit of testing here to see what works for you. I'm just going to say that's good. I'm going to call this left underscore clavicle. So select the shoulder, then the clavicle, and hit P. So now the clavicle is the parent of the shoulder. So what I was saying as far as the clavicle, if you are raising your arms above your head, it's going to look weird if it's happening just at the shoulder. Okay. Once you get to about this point, you got to start putting in some of this clavicle rotation to really lift the shoulders up. Okay, so that's why we have a clavicle joint. So now we have our joints. Next thing we want to do is orient these joints. So the orientations that we're going to use, so skeleton, orient joint, and let me activate my move tool here. Right now, the clavicle's at world space because it was created by itself. We're going to use X, Y, Y. So X, Y, Y, positive, and hit orient. Okay, so the Y is going to be up, the X is going to be pointing down to the child, and we're going to, this is this is the orientation that we want, because the Y-axis is the one that we're going to use for sort of the walking motion, forward and backward. Okay, so that is the axis that we're going to use. So X, Y, Y. And there we go. Next thing we got to do is then figure out the rotation orders. And attribute editor. So XYZ is the default. The clavicle is going to be used a lot for sort of this raising up of the or shrugging the shoulders, or just raising up the arms. XYZ, let's see. So Z is the dominant axis followed by Y. Oh, and we got to make sure that we turn on, we switch it to gimbal mode. And again, you can just double click your rotate tool and switch it to gimbal mode there. So Z for up and down, then we can move our clavicle forward or backward. That's XYZ. Rotate order. Let's try XZY. So XZY allows us to move it on the Y. It's going to take the Z with it and then raise it up. So you can sort of push your shoulders forward and raise them up. And also, move your shoulders back and still be able to raise them up. Don't know how comfortable that would be. Compared to XYZ, where if I wanted to move my shoulders forward, you see that I sort of lose the ability to keep my Z aligned here. And now when I rotate up, I get this weird sort of forward rolling here. So let's go with XZY. And again, it's up to you. It really is up to you how you want to do that. So if you had raised your arms up, and you can then move them forward, and that looks like it works. So we're going to go with XZY for that. That's the clavicle. Let's go to the shoulder. And so our Z movement to raise the arm up, and we can still go forward and backward. Okay. If we went with XZY, if we raise the arm up, you'll see that our Y-axis stays where it is. So if you want to raise your arms up level with the ground and then move them forward, you kind of lose that ability with XZY. So I think XYZ is going to work better because I can raise my arms and still move them forward and backward like this. Of course, when my arms are back like this, getting them down is going to be a problem. Now, that is an unfortunate side effect of the way that the joints are calculated, is that you know, gimbal lock is very likely. I mean, it can happen. What you got to do is pick the rotate order that's going to make it least likely to happen. And I think in this case, XYZ is going to be the one. So I'm going to zero this back out. Okay, let's go down to the elbow. And again, the elbow being a hinge joint only ever rotates this way. So that's on the y-axis. So I'm going to call this XZY. The forearm joint is only ever going to twist. So if we leave it as is, we should be okay. Doesn't really matter. I mean, we could try putting the X at the end. So let's try YZX. Or Y, what do I have it on here? YXZ. It doesn't matter. It's just, okay, YZX. I'm just going to put on YZX. It doesn't really matter. And then the wrist is, so here we're going to have the up and down happen at the wrist, and that's likely the motion that you're going to do the most at the wrist. Here is this up and down versus this side to side here. So having that z-axis be the dominant one is good, because then you can still do a side to side from there. Generally, you wouldn't turn your wrist to the side and then try to push it down, I guess. So I'm going to leave it at XYZ. Well, let's try XZY. XZY. So if you do that, yeah, I don't, let's see. Yeah, I like XYZ better, but, you know, experiment, see what you like. So XYZ on the wrist, and then the palm doesn't matter. And again, at the palm, I'm going to zero out my joint orient values, just to line it up with its parent. Okay. So that's all the rotate orders done. I'm going to save my file. I really should do this more often, because as we get further into the rig, trust me, you're gonna want to get in the habit. Okay, so now that we have that all set up, we can mirror it over. So skeleton, mirror joints, again, the YZ plane orientation, search for L underscore, replace with R underscore, mirror. So now we have the right side joints. So I'm going to take both of these clavicles and parent them under the near spine joint. So select that last and hit P. Okay, so that is the arms. Next thing we got to do is the hands. Now hands, again, in order to maintain the planar joints, we have to be very careful. So again, in the front view, I'm going to draw my joint change. So here what we have the first knuckle, second knuckle, third knuckle, and then the fingertip. Okay, don't have to be exact right now, so hit enter when you're done. And this is what we have. So I can move this top level joint, no problem. And I'm going to rotate it. I'm going to get out of gimbal mode, go to object mode, and rotate it into place. Now, this you want to take the time to get it right, because it's kind of important to make sure that your fingers are bending correctly. So, and the way that these fingers are modeled, I turned the wireframe on. The way that these fingers are modeled, you see that there's a center line for every finger. And that's a good way to align your joints, to make sure that the joint is aligned to that center line. And again, all this side to side rotation I can do at the top level joint. You don't want to do that below the top level. Okay, so you want to look down the finger and use your rotate tool, this Z-axis. Use it to line up with that line of the middle of the finger. Okay, figure out the plane of that finger, which is determined by that center line going around the finger. Okay, it's going to be slightly different for each joint. Okay, when you have the alignment working the way that you like, so I more or less have it here. Okay, next thing, you have to get those knuckles to align correctly. Okay, and again, we're going to use scaling combined with rotating to align this like that. I'm going to go down this way. Again, you can rotate these finger joints in the plane of the joint chain because that's how these fingers are going to bend. So in order to get things to line up, you can rotate this way. Do not rotate this way because you're going to break your finger. Okay, so scale there. And then the tip of the finger is not really that important where it is. So that's one joint chain. And you want to freeze transformations when you're done. So if I freeze it, it's going to realign everything. Now what you don't want to do is try to use the orient joint tool here because we are not lined up with the world space. So it might mess up some of your joints. Okay, so let's rename this. So I'm going to open those up. We're going to go to modify, search and replace names, and we're going to look for the word joint and replace it with the word index because this is our index finger. So replace. Okay, so index 1 through index 4. I'm going to take that last joint, so index 4, and zero out the joint orient values. Again, just to get it to align with its parent. Okay, select this finger. Control D to duplicate it, and we're going to move it to this next finger, which is our middle finger. And we want to make sure that we align this. And again, using that center line of the finger as a guide, making sure that we place this correctly. So again, take your time. Take your time to get this right. I'm moving kind of fast here just because I want to get through this. But take your time to get it working because it's going to pay off in the end. So and as another note, when you model your fingers, again, make sure you model them straight because if some characters have bent fingers and whatnot, you can bend them this way in the axis that the finger is going to bend. That's fine, but no side to side or twisting should be modeled into it. Let the rigger set it up so that if you need that, you can set it. You can do it with the rig. Don't model it in there because it makes life a little bit difficult for the rigger. Okay, so let's see. Let's move this over just a bit. There. And maybe something like that. Okay. And then scale this to get it to that knuckle. And it gets kind of hard to see what's going on, so be careful. Okay. Again, you can scale and you can bend along the axis of the finger, but that is it. And then when you get it, freeze transformations again. So let's rename this joint chain. Go to modify, search and replace. We're going to look for the word index and replace it with middle. Okay, slide this over there, and I'm going to change this from middle 5 to middle 1. So middle 1 through 4. Okay, so let's just go ahead and do the rest of them. I'm going to time lapse this just to be fast about it. Okay, so that is the 4 fingers. Now the thumb is going to be slightly different because you can see the orientation of the thumb is on a different plane than the other fingers. So I'm just going to select my index finger. I'm going to duplicate it, move it over, and I want to make sure that I rotate this all the way around like this so that I can align things that way. Okay, the thumb is its own thing. It's kind of an annoying part of the hand, the thumb. So, but it's, you know, you got to do it, right? So again, use that center line of the thumb to align your joints, and just look down the finger. So this finger, the way the thumb bends is this first hinge here is way over here by the wrist. So I'm just gonna slide this over here, you know, something like that. And then the next joint is sort of over here somewhere. Okay, I'll rotate this up. And scale this down to here. You know what? Let's move this up here. Now this is definitely one you want to take your time with, because it is so weird. So something like that. Okay, and then when you have it, freeze transformations, and we're going to rename this one modify search and replace names. I want to look for the word index, and we're going to replace it with the word thumb, and replace. Change that. Oh, and we need to do the same here. Pinky, and there we go. Okay, so now we have the 4 fingers of the thumb. We want to parent those in somewhere. I'm not going to parent them to the arm yet because I want the hands to be independent for a while before I do that. So I'm going to just take this joint that is the palm joint on the arm. I'm going to duplicate it, and then just slide the duplicate along the X just a ways from there, and then shift P to unparent this. And I'm going to call this left hand root. Okay, so that's just everything else is going to hook into there. So select all 5 and then select the hand root last and hit P. Okay, so that is the hand root right there. That's just going to hold all the fingers. Okay, so with that done, what I need then to do is set our rotation orders, and let's see. So the way that each finger is going to bend, if I you'll see that the z-axis is the one that's going to bend the fingers. So XYZ should work. So the default rotation order should work, because we're not going to be twisting. We're not going to be bending the fingers side to side, although you could if you really wanted to. So XYZ should, oh, I need to make sure again that I'm in gimbal mode. So XYZ should work for us. Okay, get out of gimbal, go to object. Okay, I'm going to select that hand root. I'm going to go to skeleton. I'm going to go to mirror joints, YZ orientation, L underscore R underscore mirror. So we have our right hand here. Now the problem with the right hand, and you know what, I think I'm going to undo that. I'm going to undo it back here. Let's do that again. So skeleton, mirror joints. I'm going to set it to behavior, and I'm going to mirror it. Okay, so what that's done is it's reversed the X direction. So instead of pointing down the joint, it's sort of pointing in the exact opposite direction. And there's no, you can't just do a joint orient to fix that, because that's not going to match up with what's happening on the other side. So the way to fix this is to unparent all these joints. So select the start with the index finger. I'm going to do a Shift P. It's going to separate all these joints from everything else, so they're single joints now. So I'm going to select each joint. So I'm going to just select these 4 joints here, and in the Z I'm going to do a 180. So now my X is pointing down where it should be pointing. Okay, then I'm going to select all 4 of these joints again, and I'm going to freeze the transformations on them so that it maintains this new orientation. Then I'm going to select the bottom one to the second one, do a parent, this to this, hit P, and then this to this, hit P. So what we have now, you'll see that my x-axis, which is the red one, is now pointing down to the child as expected. Okay, unlike these where the x-axis is pointing upward. So again, let's do the same thing here. Let's select all 4 joints, hit Shift P, and then I'm going to, so with them all selected, rotate Z 180, hit enter, and as you can see, X is now pointing the right way. So I'm going to freeze the transformations. Then I'm going to take middle 4, put on the middle 3, take middle 3, put on the middle 2, take middle 2, put on the middle 1. Okay, so there we have that. And you know, just keep going. Select these 4, actually go 8, Shift P, go rotate Z 180, freeze transformations, and pinky 4 on the pinky 3, pinky 3 on the pinky 2, pinky 2 on the pinky 1, ring 4 on the ring 3, ring 3 on the ring 2, ring 2 on the ring 1, and there we go. And everything should be now the right way, and then just do the same for the thumb. Oops. There we go, Shift P. I'm going to put my, I'm going to put my layer on reference. Okay, so 180 in Z. Freeze transformation, so thumb 4 under thumb 3, thumb 3 under thumb 2, thumb 2 under thumb 1. And there we go. Okay, so everything looks like it's working. So I can then take all of the top level joints and parent them under my hand root. And there we go. So I'm going to save this file. And there we go. There we go. Okay, so let me turn off my wireframe. So we have now all the joints that we need to begin the rigging process. Okay, so in the next video, that's what we're going to start on. We're going to start on actually rigging the legs. We drew the skeleton. Now we have to go about rigging it. Okay, so I'll see you guys in the next video. Please, if you enjoy this content, like, comment, and subscribe. And I will keep putting these out for you as we go. All right, thanks, guys.